Okay, when you hear the word feudalism, what comes to mind, right? Knights, castles, kings, the whole medieval scene. But here's the thing. What if I told you it wasn't some grand design? That it was actually a radical, almost desperate solution to a world that was, well, literally falling apart? So let's get into it. Let's see how a simple system of promises managed to forge order from absolute chaos. So our story actually begins with an ending. You see, the great Carolingian Empire, the one built by Charlemagne, it's gone. It's crumbled. Think of it like a massive earthquake just shattered the entire continent. With no strong central government to hold things together, Europe just fractured. It broke into 1,000 tiny pieces. And what you were left with was this patchwork of isolated communities, with local rulers hunkered down in their castles just trying to protect their people from whatever was lurking right outside their walls. And believe me, those dangers were very, very real. That collapse created this huge power vacuum. And, as they say, nature, and in this case history, hates a vacuum. It basically put a giant target on the back of Western Europe. I mean, for 200 years, life was just defined by fear. And this wasn't some clear-cut war with a single enemy you could fight. No, this was a relentless crisis coming from all sides. People lived with a constant, gnawing threat that at any moment, everything they had could be looted and burned to the ground. So, who was causing all this chaos? Well, it was mainly three major groups. Coming from the north, you had the Vikings. Yep, those Vikings. From the east, the Magyars, who were just incredible horsemen. And then from the south, you had Muslim raiders, who were masters of the sea. Europe was basically caught in a giant pincer movement, attacked from both land and sea. Let's talk about the Vikings for a second, because their secret weapon was just brilliant. Their longboats. They were basically the stealth bombers of their day. I mean, these things could carry a ton of warriors, and this is the crazy part, they could sail in water that was only like 3 feet deep. So what does that let them do? It lets them zip up rivers, hit towns and villages way inland, and then just vanish before anyone could even think about mounting a defense. Absolutely terrifying. So what good is a king sitting in some faraway capital? By the time he even hears about a Viking raid, it's been over for hours. He was useless. Protection had to be local. It had to be immediate. It had to be personal. So people stopped looking to some distant king for help. Instead, they turned to the one person who could actually do something, the powerful landowner right there in their own neighborhood, the local lord. And this right here, this huge shift from central power to local power, this is what laid the groundwork for a totally new kind of society. And it's important to remember, nobody sat down and designed this thing. It just emerged. It grew organically, out of pure necessity. It was a system built for one reason and one reason only: survival. And that system, that was feudalism. At its core, it's not really about the fancy castles and the crowns. It's about two things: land and loyalty. It was a super pragmatic deal where power was spread out, and the glue holding society together was mutual promises made in a very, very dangerous world. Okay, so let's break down how this deal actually worked. It was a two-way street. You have a lord, he's the landowner, and he offers protection. In exchange for that protection, and for loyalty and military service, the lord grants a piece of his land, called a fief, to a warrior, who is now his vassal. Pretty simple, right? It's a land for loyalty swap. All right, so that's the basic deal. But how does that simple bargain turn into an entire social structure? Well, when you repeat that exchange over and over and over and over again, from the top all the way to the bottom, it creates this really complex, really rigid social hierarchy. The best way to picture it is as a pyramid. Okay, so at the very, very top of this pyramid, you've got the king. Right below him are his most powerful vassals. We're talking high-ranking nobles, powerful bishops. Now, they turn around and grant fiefs to knights, the mounted warriors who were the muscle of the medieval army. And then, at the very bottom, making up the huge base of this whole thing, we're talking way over 90% of the population, you have the peasants, the people who actually worked the land. And the kicker? Where you were on this pyramid was pretty much locked in from the day you were born. It's funny, people back then actually saw their own society in even simpler terms. They basically broke everyone down into 3 groups or orders. You had those who fought, that's your nobles and knights. You had those who prayed, the men and women of the church. And then you had those who worked, which, was basically everyone else. And here's something that's just wild. This whole setup wasn't just a European thing. A system that was incredibly similar developed completely on its own, all the way on the other side of the planet in Japan. Think about it. They had an emperor who was a figurehead, kind of like the king. They had landowning lords called daimyo, who were like the European nobles. They had their elite warriors, the samurai, who were the Japanese knights. And at the bottom, same story, peasants working the fields. It just goes to show you, when things get chaotic, humans often come up with surprisingly similar solutions to survive. Okay, but let's be real. For the vast majority of people, all those folks who worked, this big pyramid of power was pretty abstract. They weren't thinking about kings and high lords. Their entire world was much smaller. Their world was the manor. So, the manor. Think of it as the economic engine of the whole feudal system. It was the fief, that piece of land we talked about. And since trade had basically ground to a halt and just traveling was super dangerous, each manor had to be its own little self-sufficient bubble. It had to produce everything it needed to survive, from its own food and fuel to clothes and tools. A tiny, self-contained world. And what powered this little world? Just relentless, back-breaking human labor. The people who lived and worked on the manor were called serfs. Now, it's really important to get this distinction right. Serfs were not slaves. You couldn't buy or sell them. But they weren't free either, not by a long shot. They were legally tied to the land they were born on. They basically came with the property, just like the trees or the river. And the price they paid for living on that land and getting the Lord's protection? It was brutal. I mean, just listen to this. You had to work the Lord's own fields, for free, several days a week. You had to pay a tax just to use the Lord's mill to grind your grain. You wanted to get married, you had to pay a tax for that too. And after all of that, you still owed a tithe, a 10% tax to the church on whatever tiny income you had left. It was just a life of one obligation after another. There's a poem from the time called Piers Plowman, and it just captures how grim this all was. Just listen to this line, it's heartbreaking. What by spinning they save, they spend it in house hire, and they themselves suffer surely much hunger and woe in the winter with waking at nights. It just paints a picture of constant, endless struggle. And if you want to put all of this into perspective, just think about this one single number, 35. Because of the poor food, the constant disease, the sheer hardship of it all, the average life expectancy for a peasant was just 35 years old. So yeah, it was a brutal system, it was incredibly unequal, and it was born out of pure desperation. But, and this is the interesting part, its legacy is actually really complex, and it makes you wonder, why should we care about this system of lords and vassals and serfs from more than 1,000 years ago? What does it have to do with us today? Well, believe it or not, hidden inside this really harsh system is an idea, a surprisingly modern idea that would eventually change everything. Okay, here's the key takeaway. For all its problems, the deal between a lord and his vassal was not one of absolute power. It was a contract. It was based on mutual obligations. A lord had responsibilities to his vassal, just as the vassal had responsibilities to his lord. And this idea, the idea that even the most powerful people are bound by their promises, that was, for the time, absolute revolutionary. And this is where you see the long arc of history in action. That idea that governing is a two-way street, that rulers actually have responsibilities to the people they rule, that idea is a direct descendant of that old feudal bargain. It's a core principle that would one day become the bedrock of modern representative government. So you see, out of the ashes of a fallen empire, this desperate system built on promises actually laid the very first essential stones on the long road to our world today. It was a brutal solution for a brutal time, but it might have been the only thing that could have forged order out of chaos.